Fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences too. Sir Boris has had a very illustrious and distinguished academic and clinical research career. His research contribution includes Europe's first trial of a therapeutic vaccine for HPV to treat cervical cancer. Sir Boris was knighted in 2001 for his contribution to medical education and research into developing vaccines. It's a great honor and privilege to have you, Sir Boris, with us to address the keynote today. So I welcome Dr. Sir Boris to address the keynote. Over to you.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, good morning, and firstly, may I just offer my congratulations to the India Alliance on their 10th birthday. You've really broken new ground, and particularly being able to see the huge quality and the amazing number of over 300 fellows who've benefited from the work that you have been doing. And what I'd like to do is to cover the potential direction in which engagement, particularly with Cancer Research UK, and the way we actually see the directions that life sciences are going to take cancer research in the future. I think it's up. Okay. Now, this presentation comes with a warning, and that is that it is very much a, sorry, I'm not sure this is moving on. No, the slide's not projecting. Sorry, that slide is not projecting. So you've got that up, but you haven't got the... Sorry. Take two. Right, what I'm going to do is to start with the health warning in relationship to this talk. Basically, current improvements in cancer care are, as far as I'm concerned, the result and consequences of 40 years or more investment in basic life science research. We would be nowhere in cancer research without that absolutely important fundamental commitment. Secondly, the future is totally unpredictable, but there are signposts as to where we will be taking cancer research and cancer care over the next 12 to 15 years. The health warning comes that this is a completely eclectic collection, which now as a chairman rather than chief executive I'm able to do. And that's to pick my 7 or 8 key publications that I have seen in 2018 that I see as signposts for the way forward. You also know that chairmen do not set the strategies for organizations, but they're actually there only to make sure the governance and everything else is working properly. But needless to say, at least I hope that these will stimulate some debate and discussion. So I may be well wide of the mark, but this is at least a personal view as to where I think the direction will come in the future. So firstly, the question is, how far is behavior and variation that we observe a consequence of intrinsic change in the cancer cell. So far, we have taken a perspective that, as far as I'm concerned, cancer is a somatic cell genomic disease. And wherever the anatomical location of that disease, it may have a bearing on how we manage cancer, but at the end of the day, the fundamental process is reasonably well understood at the present time. The question is how much of that is intrinsic to the cancer cell and how much is it from the environment the cancer cell finds itself in? And this series of studies from Hans Klaver's lab, I think, are really very, very important and an important signpost. The experiment that he's conducted is actually very simple in its construction. And that is to say, let us take a colonic polyp, which we know from the Vogelstein model is probably the result of a clonal aberration that occurs at a single part of the epithelium in the colon. And therefore, if you like, the polyp that arises is actually something that comes from a single cell at one point. By the time we see the polyp, that has already moved on. And the question was, if you take subclones of a single polyp, how do those subclones behave, and how much variation has happened from that very first single change? And if you place that in culture, because we now have the culture conditions to be able to maintain it for a few divisions, what do we actually see that if you remove it out of the environment of the body, how does that clone behave? And the bottom line is, this is where the complexity starts, because the answer is very, very differently from subclones of the same polyp. And here's just to give you an example from that particular publication. This is the clones from the same tumor show massive variation in the acquisition of mutations. So subclone 1, which is shown basically as P1 tumor, has around 75,000 mutations occurring in about 5 cycles of cell division. Very different to the one that is identified as P3 tumor from a different subclone. And what you're seeing there is a much lower rate of mutation, but new signature mutations arising more frequently compared with the more stable mutations you're tending to see. And this does not just mean point mutations. It actually means in translocations, in inversions, deletions, and everything else that is actually going on. So once you have the polyp, every one of those subclones is exploding in its own direction. And that has 2 very important messages. We always thought that gene silencing was going to be very dependent on the environment the cell finds itself in. The simple result of that study suggests that the gene silencing is also a random event that occurs in the cancer cell removed from its normal environment. And secondly, and possibly more important therapeutically, is that every subclone demonstrates every form of resistance to therapy, such that the conclusion has to be you could not hit the patient with any form of chemotherapy which is going to be absolutely clearing all of the potential malignant cells. And this takes you down a line of beginning to think of cancer more as we think of HIV, that as resistance develops to one, you might predict what the combination chemotherapy is going to have to be in the future, but you're not looking at complete eradication because, frankly, the combination you'd have to use would kill the patient. You have to look to the possibility that you will have to have multiple cycles as each recurrence occurs in that individual. And that needs a mindset change in cure to care to long-term management of cancer, moving firstly for cure wherever we can to get there faster, but if we can't, the second stage of the conversion of cancer from a major catastrophic diagnosis to a chronic disease is actually something we can genuinely aspire to. So if mutation rates and complexities in gene silencing are so complex, can science ever convert this to an effective diagnosis and application to clinical practice? And I'm going to give this a qualified yes. and say particularly that we will get there as a result of a number of studies that Cancer Research UK initiated in the TRACER-X period. And these studies have tried to track recurrence and preclinical diagnosis. A very complex slide, but it's only there to remind me that this goes to the studies of Abosh et al. In Nature. And what you can look at here is a very simple observation. And that is, if we can find a driver mutation, can we begin to track that mutation in a particular patient? And can circulating tumor DNA actually predict the outcome long before you see radiological change? This could have big connotations in clinical practice, because it might mean we will not be using radiology to follow up patients, but initiating treatment based on circulating tumor DNA. That little graph in the corner shows you that at the moment, the amount of circulating tumor DNA is actually dependent very much on the radiological load of tumor that's actually visible. There is a direct correlation between it. So the bottom line of these studies suggests that circulating DNA can predict recurrence, but it's at the limit of resolution, and it's just about comparable to CT. The difference is, if you look at a CT of the nodules of somebody who's been a smoker, you can't predict which of those nodules might actually be malignant and will actually grow in the future, whereas a circulating tumor DNA can begin to draw that prediction. And so we have technology to still fall back on. We're still a log order below the sensitivity of where circulating tumor DNA can really work effectively diagnostically, but it is something that could be very useful, particularly in determining recurrence, even though it is still some way away from being able to predict primary tumors before we can actually see them. So if detection of mutations can help track tumor recurrence, and the technology will improve, could it replace imaging? I think that's a reasonable question to ask. Could it provide added value? For instance, the nature of that tumor DNA, could it predict what the resistance is likely to be, and therefore help you as an oncologist actually define what we should be doing in terms of tumor? So if it's helpful in the individual patient, can we draw conclusions to the benefit of wider numbers? And here I turn to the papers in Cell for the Cell Genome Atlas studies coming from the United States. If you analyze 10,000 tumor samples genomically for 33 cancer types, and you use, in essence, they claim they're using 26 different software tools to analyze that data, without going into the detail, you can see you end up with 299 genes that appear to be very common driver mutations across the whole spectrum of tumors. Now that in itself is quite an interesting reduction process in what's going on at individual cancers. But it has one other connotation. And in that study, they showed that 57% of sequenced tumors have the potential for treatment, that is, actionable oncogenic events that are occurring. And it's the lower graph I want you to look at in particular, that these that if you can detect a signature mutation, already 57% of those mutations have a drug either in active trial or already approved by the FDA. So what we're looking at here is a wholesale change in the way in which our oncology clinics are going to be potentially managed and what they're going to be looking at in the future. So we're going to have less interest in whether this is a renal cancer or a brain cancer or an ovarian cancer, but increasingly looking to those molecular signatures to define how we're going to approach both the chemotherapeutic, the radiotherapy, and even defining whether surgery is necessary or should it be performed. And the questions to help define that is whether the mutations that we see in an individual patient, we're now moving away from grouped patients, right down to precision medicine to the individual patient. The TRACER-X studies for renal cancers begin to show how this is possible. We've known for some time that clear cell cancer of the kidney has this unusual potential that it's sometimes worth taking out solitary metastases in some patients with complete recovery of the patient. The question was, does this have a molecular basis? And the studies that were conducted, actually published in 3 consecutive papers in Cell the week after the tumor genome atlas, show that in essence, in the far left-hand end of this slide, the primary mutation probably occurs about 20 years in a little group of 2 or 3 tubular cells in the kidney. And in many, probably that's it. But sometimes that will progress in the characteristic Vogelstein model. That progression is defined in 2 areas. It's not the primary driver mutation, it's the further driver, the secondary mutations, that will define the behavior of that tumor. So in the upper group that you find the BAP1s, the VHLs, and other clonal drivers like the RAP1 mutations, you will have rapidly progressive disease. And in those patients, you actually have to be clear that it may not even be worth taking out the primary tumor, but you need to start systemic treatment. But in the second group, you actually have a very benign form of disease where quite radical approaches, even to metastatic disease, can be curative. And certain metastases can lie around for 20 plus years without causing the patient trouble, all defined by the driver mutations that you're actually finding. So again, the molecular signatures are beginning to point us to a different approach as to how we're going to manage cancer. So what about metastases? What's the paper that has really caught my attention in relationship to metastases? How much variation occurs at the metastatic site? Now, the data from the first series of papers from Clavers tends to suggest that in reality the greatest variation occurs at the site of the primary, not at the site of the metastasis. And for me, that's really great news, because it does mean the metastatic disease is open to a relatively aggressive treatment in the future. And Reiter's work in Science, and this is from Novak's group, addressed a very important question. And they addressed this in 20 cancer patients with 115 samples and 76 untreated metastases. The problem with this sort of study, you need to catch the metastases that are untreated. And they asked which of these models actually applies to metastases. Is there a dominant clone within the primary tumor that seeds all metastases? Or is it a subclone that seeds metastases, or a subclone that treats some metastases? Well, the bottom line, and I can't go into the details, is that in most tumors, that is the dominant model. Only in rapidly growing tumors, slowly growing tumors, do you begin to see the second 2 mathematical structures that arise. And that means that you do need to be able to monitor the whole of that tumor if you're going to try to predict where the metastases occur. But it does also point to the fact that most metastases carry a single signature. So can this lead to new modalities of treatment? Well, you could have hours spending on immunotherapy. This is the immunophenome. Do not run away that immunotherapy is going to be the answer for everything. It isn't. It's got huge variation. And these are the problems rather than the success stories we hear about. Many tumors lose HLA, and therefore both CAR-T and other treatments are not going to be of particular value in those patients. There are neoantigens escape pathways. There's promiscuous binding and T-cell responses. You open up autoimmunity, and particularly an encephalomyelitic syndrome that is occurring in some of these patients. And there's also the impact of concurrent therapies. So immunotherapy is still very much in its infancy, and our capacity to define its best use is some way away. So do these advances take us further in the pathway to improve patient care? I think they do. I think mutations can be of value in early diagnosis. That is beginning to be established and will be established for more tumors in the next year or two. Can they predict tumor and metastatic localization? Again, the answer is a guarded positive, that it will be able to predict tumor behavior. Can they predict outcome? Well, at least in the renal case, that is certainly true, but I think we're starting to see that that will be true of other tumors. And can they predict future therapeutic targets? Most definitely, yes. The problem is yes, but proving it and implementing it are actually more difficult than actually establishing the principle. So we have to move to multimodality therapeutics. Cancer is an interesting disorder in that we use surgery, drugs, we use radiotherapy quite frequently in a variety of combinations. If you come in with a new treatment, such as immunotherapy in the green box, we use it at the moment as salvage therapy right at the far end. Now, as an immunologist, I can tell you that is absolutely, completely and utterly cockeyed. If you had to use immunotherapy, it should be the primary modality of treatment before you've shot the immune system to pieces with radiotherapy, surgery, and chemotherapy. And yet we don't use it there. To just do the trials to determine the optimum positioning of each of these four modalities of treatment and how you sequence those four modalities of treatment is 4 factorial clinical trials. Just ponder that for a moment. That's before you make a single change in any of the agents you're going to use. But each of them cause comorbidity and multimorbidity issues, especially as we have an aging population with cancer. So the scale of the problem, trying to get this in my own, wrap my own head around this, is if you have 50 active chemotherapeutic agents, we all use them in combinations of 4. That's 50 to the power 4 combinations. And AI will tell you from the HIV story, we can't predict which of those combinations is going to be best. Then we have, let's say, about 50 tumors, so there'll be at least 4 to 5 anatomical staging procedures. That's 250 to the power 4. And if you add molecular markers X, that's 4 times X, whatever that may be, and add Y, any other variable you want to take into considerations, you come up with a solution that there are not enough patients in the world to do phase 3 trials for cancer. So is the day of the phase 3 trial dead? For cancer, I'm going to go and say probably outside of major class agents, it may well be. And we're going to have to adapt to far less active knowledge of what is going to be needed in the future. So this brings forward to the research community some very serious questions. That clinical trials and evaluation methodology research is going to be as important in changing the way in which we can get more value out of every single patient we treat and we engage with than currently, dare I say, the conventional body bag count that we do in a phase 3 trial. We also have to consider provisional licensing. 13 years from bench discovery to bedside isn't much use to you if you have a glioblastoma with an 18-month prognosis period. Just like HIV patients, you want access to the treatment tomorrow. You know, if I found myself in that unfortunate position, you know what I'd be doing? I'd be ringing up Sigma, getting the basic chemicals, getting my friendly chemist to synthesize whatever it was there. And I don't give a damn about what the patents and everything else actually says. So why should I be treated differently to many others in the world that will be facing this problem? But it carries a corollary, and probably the most difficult thing, that patients will have to be part of that process, and they have to accept greater risk. If this is to happen, they get earlier access, they have to forego the right to sue the company. And that is not going to be that easy. As our lawyer community will tell you very quickly, you have no right to give up your right to suit for negligence. Ponder. If you're a neuropathologist, this paper tells you you'll be out of work in a short period of time. What this is showing you already the implications of artificial intelligence in the neuropathology community. This study was very simple and straightforward. It basically took just tumor methylation profile from glioblastomas against the WHO criteria identified by pathologists. Now, the reason this was chosen was not because this was having a go at neuropathologists. It's just that the WHO criteria are very well defined in neuropathology. In essence, 60%, there was a complete concordance. But remember, you're only looking at methylation profile. In an additional 15%, there was concordance with just minor subclassification issues. The problem is with the other 25%. Firstly, I'm not surprised, but in reality, in 12% of cases, the computer was right, the pathologist was wrong. And these are good pathologists. But more interestingly, the last 11% told us the classification is all wrong, and that in reality there are different ways of ensuring the classification will occur. So will artificial intelligence and machine learning here in pathology, in radiology, robotics in surgery, actually change the direction in which we are going? And then the billion, literally billion-dollar, trillion-dollar question. This is the data from IARC for the number of new cancer cases, the incidence. This is not the prevalence, this is the incidence of new cases of cancer globally. That is the global projection from 2012 to 2035. That, I hope, maybe I'm saying that optimistically in my case, is still within my lifetime. What do the numbers mean for India? Now, take these with a big pinch of salt. The UK data is probably pretty rock solid, but this is dependent on cancer registry data. I'm afraid I just do not believe 1.15 million cases of cancer in India a year. China is currently standing at 4.1 million. Unless something miraculous is happening in India, which has a very low incidence, it means underreporting is very, very significant here. But even on that underreporting, the projection is, look at the percentages. The percentage increase in incidence in India is going to grow by 65%. So if that number is closer to 3 million, just project up 65% on top of that by 2035. This, for a health minister, is the nightmare to end all nightmares, especially if you add my optimism that we will have more patients with a prevalence of cancer, but living longer with the cancer, but under clinical care. So forget all the issues with diabetes, cardiovascular, stroke, and elsewhere, which are huge in their own implications. This is an absolute financial storm that's waiting to hit. And I'm afraid the only solutions are going to be technology and the use of artificial intelligence to help dissect out what's better. But it also carries something else, that healthcare reform is absolutely to the forefront. Today's systems, whether it's the NHS or whether it's healthcare in India or whether it's healthcare in America or France or Germany, is just not capable of delivering what will be required in the future. And that, friends, is actually the most difficult thing where science is actually directing us. The science is telling us that we will have to reform the way in which we manage healthcare for patients with cancer. So, in conclusion, we have to take a global perspective. In Cancer Research UK, we're doing this through global collaboration, and today we'll be signing agreements and arrangements to be able to open up joint working between India and Cancer Research UK in the UK. It's a toe in the water, but it's a message as well that we have to take a global solution to this global problem. So in conclusion, understanding biology of cancer is fundamental to developing intelligence, evidence-based treatments and advances in clinical care. The Grand Challenges issue is very important. This is about getting collaboration across continents, across countries. No single institution or individual is going to find all the solutions, but international teams and international collaboration can get there. The novel developments will come from a variety of directions. I'm usually challenge, because I say more is going to come out of computing, physics, and engineering than will come out of biology, particularly in the shorter term. How well are our institutions geared to take advantage of that? And how do we develop new approaches to evaluation? Our current systems are arcane, slow, and not fit for purpose with the urgency with which patients require it. We must deal with that as a matter of some speed and alacrity. And how do we ensure that evidence-based prevention and early diagnosis, which we know is the best way to keep that prevalence up high and the incidence as low as possible, how do we actually implement those strategies? I say in the NHS is relatively easy because it's a whole nation system, but how do you do it where you've actually got both private and state-run systems running in parallel? And how do we support and help the NHS to continue to improve and deliver to patients? I'm a complete believer in state-led systems, and that's why I use the terminology NHS. But whatever system you operate, there is no excuse for not doing that, because at the end of the day, we're all here because of the individual patients who are out there and have those problems and have to face those problems with their family. And my belief and optimism is that science will continue to drive this. The question for all of us, whether we're basic scientists or applied scientists, is how do we ensure that the individual patient can benefit from all that work? Thank you.
Thank you, Sir Boris, for a very insightful talk. Now the hall is open for questions.
Quite revealing and incredible perspective. Thank you for that. But you did mention that there was a certain bottleneck in terms of metastasis that the cancers experience. Now, can you elaborate a little bit on that? Is it a mechanistic bottleneck in terms of the cellular machinery that contributes towards metastasis, or is it something else that you were thinking about?
I think the current evidence, and particularly there's Novak's paper, there's a whole slew of papers coming around about metastasis. What we can begin to draw as conclusions is the amount of variation that occurs in the metastasis itself is much smaller than at the site of primary tumor. It also looks that the seeding is occurring probably quite early in the evolution of cancer. And so we have two questions now. What makes particular metastases dormant? There's a lovely example in the Tracer X studies on renal, which show that the very rare pancreatic metastasis occurs very early in that tumor, but will lie dormant for 20 years. And it's a particular driver that takes it to the pancreas. We don't know whether it's the driver that initiates the slowness with which that recovers, or whether it's the environment in which it finds itself. And I think, to me, that's the billion-dollar question with metastasis. The optimism is, because of the lower rate of mutation intrinsic in the metastasis, there are some serious questions that will now have to be asked. Should you take out the primary tumor, even in metastatic disease, if that's what's happening? Because you might get, as Novak is suggesting, you might get subsidiary clones developing, which again will show new metastatic seeding. So that's a very important question. And if you just extrapolate from that, the burden you now throw on surgery is quite enormous. Then you've got the whole question of the anatomical location of metastasis. So it's not just the dealing with the underlying mutations and change, it is actually dealing with the physical location of the metastasis. If you happen to have it close to the spinal cord, of course you've got to deal with the physicality of the metastasis as well. So that's why I think we're in a very interesting area. What makes for dormancy in metastasis? What makes metastases respond? And we've all seen that in the clinic, where some will respond, some will not respond. How do we actually vary the treatments and the resistance that we actually map from metastasis? And can we predict that from the mutations that we're seeing at the primary? All of those, I think, are going to be mapped out in the next 4 to 5 years. And in particular, there is a grand challenge that we're trying to hold as to what causes the dormancy question. If we could, for example, convert metastasis from active to dormant, That may help many people live an absolutely normal life. But it's the reason for my optimism in genuinely believing we can move cancer into a completely different place from the devastating diagnosis it is today.
Hello. At least from the probabilistic point of view, don't you think that the cells which are already metastatic, which has undergone metastasis, might undergo a lot of changes other than the original tumor?
Yeah.
So it's really surprising what you heard right now told, and still, what could be the mechanism?
That's what we don't know. I don't know what the mechanism is likely to be, and the questions posed in that science paper in relationship to metastasis, what restricts it. It may well be the very nature of the cell that seeds. So in other words, it's seeded earlier when there are fewer driver mutations at the time it was first seeded. But also its control may actually be external and more from the stroma and the environment in which the metastatic cell actually finds itself. So I think that's where you've got a very serious lot of research that will still need to be done to define those criteria, and therefore whether we can change that into new therapeutic modalities as a consequence of that work. To me, it's probably the most exciting area of cancer research at the moment.
Really unbelievable.
So Boris,
Yeah.
here. Thank you for a very informative talk. What is the status of liquid biopsies in clinical diagnosis, and what are the pitfalls?
So liquid biopsies, we can look at a variety of areas. In my world, previously, it was cervical cancer, and therefore looking for viral genes was what we see as liquid biopsies. But most people refer to it as circulating tumor DNA, the capacity to look either for tumor cells or for signatures in the area. From my point of view, we need technological advance still to improve the sensitivity, but it comes with a particular health warning. I did this so long ago. Can I ask anybody over the age of 60 to please put up their hand? Okay, good. Very nice young population here. Those of us over the age of 60, work published this week, show that 50% of our cells in the esophagus already carry one driver mutation. The miracle is that we don't all end up with esophageal cancer. It's the question turned around the other way. But it has a real connotation to liquid biopsy. Once we improve the sensitivity, for example, of circulating tumor DNA, there will be a background noise because we all accumulate driver mutations. It doesn't mean to say we will all go on to develop cancer. So how do you define what the background noise is going to be as opposed to when you believe a peak actually comes out? Or do you end up with the problems we've got at the moment with prostate-specific antigen testing, where you'll get some signal, but you don't really know what that signal is? And therefore, how will you be able to use the liquid approach towards primary diagnosis is an issue. Where I see liquid biopsy really working well is actually in prediction of recurrence, and therefore in defining the individual. Because once you know the driver mutation, you know specifically what you're looking for, and current technologies are at the point of almost there at the point of sensitivity. So I do see in the next 5 years a greater application in the individual patient and a prediction potentially of the resistance that is going to be present in the recurrent tumor. So yes, we will see that being more and more applied. How soon will depend on how the technology is able to pick up, both in terms of sensitivity and specificity.
Listening to your talk, I sometimes saw a correlation between the way cancer is being thought of now and antimicrobial resistance.
Yep.
In terms of pre-existing mutations already being there. And therefore, I wonder whether further approaches would be in terms of the way AMR is being handled. That is, targeting multiple targets at lower doses to try to weaken, in that case, the bacterium, but in this case, perhaps the cancer cell, in terms of being obliterated from the system.
Well, Here I have to recognize CRU's prescience in having somebody from infectious diseases actually chairing the organization, because it almost is precisely like that. The issue, though, is, and the big difference, is using lower doses of multiple medications will still kill the patient, because we don't have the selectivity that we do have in trying to define antimicrobial resistance, and we're still using very toxic agents which are not specifically targeted at cancer cells, and therefore the bystander effects, if you use 10 agents at lower dose, is still going to be very much greater. So I think it's like the AMR problem, but squared. It's actually that we don't have the specificity. As we develop that in a variety of ways, and I know there's exciting work going on in India looking at this, looking at affinity and the capacity to develop better agents, that is something that would be of importance. At the moment, we're kind of in the position of saying we can kill 99% of the cells, and we know some are going to come back. We can even predict which drugs you might be able to use. But it's also changing the patient mindset into the fact that when you go and see your oncologist and he says, well, there's a recurrence, that's not the end of the road and a move to palliative care. It's merely another stage in managing the process. And in HIV, we've seen that time and time again, and we've reached the point there where people can live as long with HIV as they can in a normal lifespan. And for me, that would be success if the quality of life is good.
So what role does socioeconomic status and nutrition play in cancers? Like, is there a difference between, the prevalence and triggers in developing countries versus developed countries?
Yes, they do play a very big part. The disease par excellence in cancer, which is associated with poverty and socioeconomic status, is cancer of the cervix. That I can really vouch for, is you find that in the poorest communities, whatever society you work in. When I was working in Africa, I knew exactly where to find cases. It's the most strongly associated cancer, even when you control for smoking and a whole lot of other parameters in this area. So we do see some linkage to deprivation. The other elements are nutrition is really very difficult. We have this association with obesity. But at the recent World Congress, we saw data coming from South America where being overweight actually protects against premenopausal breast cancer, but postmenopausal breast cancer, it actually is acting as a risk factor. Recent reports about how obesity might be associated with cancer is, I think, a little premature for the conclusions they're drawing, but nevertheless, understanding how obesity is associated and why it's only associated with 13 cancers rather than the whole gamut is really going to be quite important as to its causality. Undernutrition, not particularly associated, but you do have then the environmental factors like Helicobacter and things in stomach and other conditions. So you've got to be aware that there are a very important slew of environmental factors that impact, of which poverty and socioeconomic status and nutritional status will doubtless be part and parcel of that. It has not been fully defined, and there's a lot of work to do to still try to get to the bottom of it, and particularly to understand why.
Okay. So thank you, Sir Boris, once again.
Thank you.
For your insightful talk and gracing the occasion. So now we're going to have a panel discussion on creating robust research ecosystems for India. So welcome the panelists. The panelists are Professor Satyajit Mayer, Director NCBS, who is also our Margadarshi Fellow. Professor Balram Bhargava, Director General ICMR. Professor Ashok Venkataraman, Director MRC Cancer Unit and University of Cambridge. Dr. Shailja Gupta, Head International Division, Department of Biotechnology, and Professor Mike Turner from the Wellcome Trust. I also welcome our moderator for the session, Dr. Savita Iyer from the Jacaranda Tree. Dr. Iyer is a research management professional and founder of the Jacaranda Tree. She has been instrumental in setting up the Research Development Office at the NCBS InSTEM cluster. She has also been associated with IndiaAlliance through the India Research Management Initiative. I welcome the panelists and the moderator to please come onto the dais. Over to you, Savita.
No, you can't. Can you hear? Okay. So this panel discussion is about creating robust ecosystems at Indian research organizations. So India has seen very significant investments in science, in people, infrastructure, institutions, projects. But there is an additional sort of hidden element which also needs some attention. And this is what we are referring to as the research ecosystems. And really, one of the themes, so the panel discussion today is going to take place over three major themes, which is what are the benefits of having robust ecosystems? How does one build capacity for ecosystems? And how can funders and institutions work together to do so? So as a starting point, I'd like to request Jitu. You're the director of NCBS and InSTEM. And NCBS and InSTEM, the campus has India's first professional research development office, which offers a very comprehensive range of support services, part of this research ecosystem we're referring to. So the office was started in 2010. And clearly there was a lot of thought that went into the office. The management had various discussions, and there was a rationale behind setting up an enterprise like that. So it'd be really nice if you could share some thoughts on what led to the creation of the office.
Thanks, Savita. So let me just take a step back. Before 2010, so before 2010, NCBS was a small institute. It had about 25 researchers. And in 2009, InSTEM had just come into being, and we were foreseeing a expansion in the campus on a much larger scale. And so we believe that in about 10 years, we would be at around 50 researchers on the campus, or maybe more. And in fact, that's where we are at. And we're not more simply because there are certain limitations on hiring. So because of that, the trajectory that we were foreseeing, we figured that if we didn't act to make the research funding and research support a core activity of the institution and not of the PI, we felt we would become out of step with what's happening in the biological sciences. And now I'm going to ask you a question, because we asked you to help set up this research development office. And I think at that point, articulated a few charges, which the RDO, as we call it, was made to take up. So it might be useful for us to hear about what you thought your mandate was, if I may put that question to you.
Sure. So I remember this conversation in the director's office, and there were a couple of dots on a whiteboard. So there was NCBS, there was InSTEM, CCAMP, another entity, and possibly another research institute. That was the picture. And so I was asked to use my experience in research funding gained working at the Wellcome Trust, my knowledge of life sciences, to bring process into a wonderful, freewheeling academic environment, really, and make that palatable for the researchers. So the shape this took was really creating a research development office. And one of the first charges was to actually start understanding what funding opportunities there were for, at that point, NCBS researchers, which needed me not just to listen to everyone's scientific ideas, but to gather some information and understanding of the different kinds of funders who are willing to work with an Indian organization. And so one of the key mandates sort of became, how can we make it easy for researchers at NCBS to apply for grants so that they can focus on writing the proposal and a lot of the hard graft is just taken out of their way. And in many ways, that became the ethos of the office, which was how can we facilitate science at this growing campus, growing from one institution to a cluster of 3 institutions with different kinds of science, different career levels for the investigators, working with Indian government agencies, with other Indian local foundations, agencies, international organizations, and really broadening the portfolio, the opportunities that the researchers had. So in other words, if a PI would come into my office and sort of say, well, this is my idea, this is what I would like to do, how should I fund this idea? Well, what we thought was that this office should be able to offer advice saying, well, here's the agency you should go to, this is the scheme you should go to, these are the deadlines coming up, and we'll take comprehensive care of this, we'll help you in every possible way. So really lowering the activation energy barrier for the researchers to apply for funding. So it started with that, but then of course over a period of about 8 years, this branched out into many, many directions. So we realized that international partnerships was another major area where we could and we did help. Because again, there is a lot of work involved behind the scenes to making a partnership possible, whether it's at the individual researcher level, institutional level, or larger levels, in national levels. And the average scientist does not have the time or the administrative background to take care of these matters. And so having a research development office meant that we could actually support the institution and the researchers in those ways. And then, of course, came the whole sort of post-award grant management, because once there were lots of grants to manage, one had to do that properly. And there was another development that happened at INSTEM, which was part of the campus, the NCBS campus. And that's another question I'm going to bounce back to Jitu now. So research at INSTEM is structured fundamentally differently from that at NCBS. So this needed the research development office to work with the management and the INSTEM researchers in a completely different way, new opportunities for us to support team science. And so that became another large piece of work that the office did take on. So I'm going to bounce this question back to Jitu now about team science and this collaborative mode of working, and what does it take to build an ecosystem like that?
I think there's 2 aspects to that. One is that where there's a background of a serious individual PI-driven science, I think the possibility of driving collaborative programs where individuals work together as teams becomes a viable option, because you not only have a bandwidth of basic science, but you also have groups of people coming together to work on very specific areas. And at that time, when we were beginning in STEM's move towards that kind of an activity, Jyotsna and Vijay were very supportive of this, and also driving this idea that you would build groups of people who would work on key biomedical questions collaboratively, and therefore the institution needed to recognize the power of collaboration and support individuals. You know, and as individual scientists, our motivations until this notion of a team comes along are absolutely individualistic. We're not geared, we don't even think about, we think about collaborations as instrumental in driving our own science, not about solving questions. And, you know, it's somewhat of a different, not about solving questions collaboratively. And so I think that culture at INSTEM had to evolve, and with that, a specific funding mechanism had to come about. And there, you know, I must say, you've got colleague Ashok, who came up with yet another way of looking at building a team. And I don't know if you planted that question, but if I can, if
That's
I can
right. We
ask
can
Ashok
ask
to
Ashok.
say something
Yes.
about how he built the team that he drives
Sure.
at INSTEM.
Sure. And Ashok, you have these large programs of research both at Cambridge and at INSTEM. You work the ecosystems in both places, and so it'd be lovely to hear your thoughts.
I guess my starting point is this. It's increasingly clear that there are problems, scientific problems that we all contend with, which are beyond the grasp of any individual group of scientists. Addressing these questions requires that you pull together groups that are multidisciplinary, have different talents, and are able to work together to actually solve a major problem. And I think that this is a phenomenon that we're seeing all over the world, and I personally think it's here to stay. I really think that many of the biggest questions that confront us can only be solved by this method. And you heard Boris, for example, talking about the increasing impact of not only the biological sciences, but the quantitative sciences, computing, engineering, and so on. So what does it take to build an ecosystem in which that sort of collaborative science can flourish? It's hard to give a single answer because each problem needs a tailored solution. One mode is the type of mode that Ajithu was describing at INSTEM, in many of the divisions at INSTEM, and which I think happens in many MRC units, such as the cancer unit that I direct in Cambridge. Here, there is a mission. For example, at the cancer unit, our mission can be abstracted as follows. What we would like to do is to make inroads into early intervention in cancer through a better understanding of the fundamental mechanisms that drive carcinogenesis, and the use of these mechanisms through the development of innovative enabling technologies to allow us to detect cancer early, to stratify cancer risk, and to intervene early through new methods of treatment or prevention. Now you see that the way that that problem is defined, it is intrinsically never going to be solved by a single group. Yet at the same time, it provides a common thread, a cohesiveness around which many people, clinical scientists, basic scientists, technologists can gather because they can all offer part of the solution. So in a very long-winded way, the first point I want to make is defining that common mission is so important. It needs to be articulated in a careful way such that it is not exclusive, that it does not put a straitjacket on people, making them work on one thing, but it needs to enable them not only to do what they do as imaginatively and as innovatively as possible, but also to collaborate and cooperate through this common theme or common focus. That was the first point I wanted to make. The second point I wanted to make relates to my experience in Bangalore, where the mission has been somewhat different, which is to create a set of technological platforms that can enable the use of chemical biology to understand mechanisms of disease and to find new ways of intervention in disease. Again, the focus, I think, is fairly carefully defined, even if I say so myself. But here the focus is on creating a technology platform. And therefore, what you need is a different modus operandi, which is less driven by individual groups of PIs bringing their own scientific problem to a common theme, but rather the integration of multiple different technologies, ranging from synthetic chemistry to structural biology to computational chemistry, as well as cell biology, in the pursuit of a common set of problems. You see, the structures are very different, but they're both operating in similar ways, and that's the second point I want to make. The solution to work collaboratively has to be tailored once you have appropriately formulated the problem.
Thank you so much, Ashok. So, Shelda, I have a question following on from there. You've had a long career in international relations. Again, collaborations at different levels. Would you like to share your thoughts on the importance of good governance in these kind of collaborative arrangements?
Good morning. And good governance is necessary, period, whether in international collaboration or whether without international collaborations. When I look at how bilateral collaborations, whether it is with a government funding agency or a non-government funding agency, and I compare our own governance system with the governance systems of the bilateral partners, I find that the two points when governance is concerned. One is the review system and one is the actual administrative funding mechanism. When the review is concerned, I think even the best review systems have a crack through which the best proposals do fall through. And this is across. I've seen the EU review system, I've seen the NIH, I've seen the best in the European countries. And there are various reasons for it, for which I think I can actually write a paper. But having said that, I think the experts in my partnering agencies are more mindful of the critique which they provide, which is missing in India. Our experts do not have the patience or the time to provide critique for the projects. I think it is very important because it is sort of a, what you call a inverse mentoring of the people, of the youngster, of the people who are submitting proposals. And it is important for reviewers, our experts, to provide a more detailed critique than they normally provide. Having said that, I think otherwise we match, even otherwise we do our good proposals do get through, I think simply because the number of good proposals coming in from India are relatively less in number. And so our governance in that structure, in that manner, is more or less fine. The funding mechanism is something which we are really concerned with because our administrative system is a little more complicated than the funding mechanism we have in India. We require a lot of documentations. Not that other agencies do not. They do also, but the PIs are more compliant in submitting the documentation. Our PIs are also not so compliant in submitting documentation. I think there's also a sense of entitlement within our own scientists. I really think, so I seriously think that there is a sense of entitlement within our own system, probably because it is government funding and they think it's this, it is an entitled thing and we shouldn't be asking too many questions of the PI. That said, our partners have this pool of funds which have already been allocated for a certain call. And having provided that fund, there are very minimal questions from the IFT how the program manager wants to use that fund. We do not have that flexibility. We are very much answerable to our financial division, even though we give out a call saying this is the amount of money which we will have for that call. And that is why, you know, structures like the DBT Welcome Trust India Alliance are helpful for us. One, because they have the flexibility and independence of doing what they want to do. And second, they can also hire more people than the government of India can do. And like Jitu just said that we are hiring is a problem within the government. And within the funding agency, whether it's the Department of Biotechnology or the Department of Science and Technology, we are completely understaffed, we are stretched, and we are overworked. And there's only this much you can manage a research project when you are overworked. So I think that's why we should be setting up more independent funding structures which allow better research management within a government structure as well.
Just to pick up on a point over there, are there any institutional structures or any institutional processes where you feel that it makes it easier? It's not working. Hello? So there's obviously what happens at the funding agencies, but then the institutions are putting proposals through to the funding agencies. So are there any institutional processes that you regard as being particularly helpful in...
Savita, you guys are getting me started, and I'm going to say very many undiplomatic things which I shouldn't be saying. I really think there is a lot of processes which need to be set up within funding agencies. I've been saying this time and again, our processes are so individual driven. If I am interested in funding a program, I can fund it within 2 weeks. If I'm not, I can delay it for as more as 2 years. We can be slothful, we can be very active, and we are not accountable. And truly speaking. And we really need to set up processes in place. And it's so individual driven, and I've been saying this to our secretaries time and again, that it's all very well to talk about science, but you people have not, and I think Dr. Vijayaraghavan dislikes it when I say you people. I think you people have not really put in their minds in improving the processes of the funding. I think Dr. Rajiv Sharma is here, and I saw him. He was heading SUB, and I think even there we have managed to mess it up a little bit. And we really need to have structures in place and processes. It cannot be individual driven. It cannot be, an organization cannot be driven.
So maybe this is a theme we could come back to later during the, with the questions as to how funders and institutions. Ashok, you wanted to say something.
I wondered if I could just take the opportunity to follow up with a question to Shailaja, because
No, this is not for anyone to get hammered.
I was very interested in a point that you made, which has also been my experience of a big difference between the UK funding system and that in the DBT, which is what you mentioned, and if I can paraphrase that to say, almost a subordination of the scientific process to a financial process. This is not something that I've encountered in the UK, where, for example, the finance division might come back and say, we've authorized this item of equipment, now tell us where you're going to house it, how big the footprint is. I've never had financial people without a scientific background asking me questions like that, but I do get that from the DBT. And I wondered what you thought of this process and whether there was any prospect for changing it. Do you think it's necessary?
I wouldn't go as far as saying that we're secondary to financial requirements. We do recommend projects, and it comes from the expert committees, and finance does not turn down a project. They do play around with the budget, however. And that is also, again, an intrinsic systemic problem. And there have to be checks and balances. And because the systems haven't been put into place, the finance has to put in those checks and balances. And we have had instances where even the PI hasn't put in too much thought in his budget requirement. Very, very, very slothful job, I must say. And also as a government organization, we have to be more careful about. So it is not really, I wouldn't say it's a problem in isolation, it's a collective problem, right from the scientists to the governance and to the financial. And I think deep thought needs to go into how do we restructure our whole scientific research governance. And this, like Savita says, really needs another detailed discussion.
Thank you so much, judges. So on that note, Mike, I'm going to ask you a few questions. So you're a trustee of the India Alliance, and would you like to share some thoughts on why the Wellcome Trust and the India Alliance have decided to focus on building research ecosystems in India, how this has come about as one of the strands of work through the India Alliance?
Okay, I'm going to start with the disclaimer. I take no credit for this whatsoever. This was decided about 12 years ago by, I was still just a mere, an academic in a regional university in the UK at that time. What I believe happened was that people at Wellcome wanted to internationalize what they did, which is a good thing. They then looked literally a very, very simple, crude way at different geographies of the world and worked out a combination of where would the chance to get most bang for the buck and where would be a most potentially supportive environment and where's the potential for greatest growth. And somebody came along with the decision we really ought to go and talk to people in India. And those of you here at Monday then got this wonderful anecdote about people barging into each other, drinking glasses of red wine. And the more red wine was drunk, the better the deal got. And I'm really going to go back to the UK and see if I get the same version of the story from the other side of the equation. So there are many elements to any ecosystem. And the most important element to this ecosystem is you lot. It's not anyone on this stage, trust me. We have our roles to play. And if you're under 50, your role is greater than if you're over 50. I'm allowed to say that. Most of you under 50 are not. But it's true. But we all have different roles to play. And an illustration comes from this little exchange here. So when I was an academic, I put in routine grants for the stuff to do in my own lab. Finance backed off and just let me get on with it. It was great. When I and a friend came up with a cunning plan for a £30 million bid, finance were all over us like a rash because they had no option. Because the way UK university ecosystem works is financially it's all about cash flow. And in an organisation with a budget, a turnover annually of £360 million sterling, a £30 million bid spread over 5 years disrupted the cash flow in a way that they needed to understand to make sure there was nothing being perturbed elsewhere in the ecosystem. And that's just a little case study of where you have to be careful. And government organisations always have to be more careful with their cash because they're responsible, actually, to you because you're the taxpayers who are ultimately generating the money that actually goes to this enterprise. So, do you want me to stop there or shall I keep going?
No, keep going.
Going. Okay. So, I was an academic for 30 years. I understand what it's like, I think, still to be on that side of the fence. But 5 years ago, I jumped to a different side of the fence. So the role of funders, we have a role to play in this ecosystem. And what's quite interesting is you compare funders around the world, and every funder tries to do it slightly differently. And that's a good thing. And what's particularly important in India is that you have a pluralistic funding system. So you always have multiple funders in any particular space, because funders will always try and find their way in the world that is slightly different. And they should, because funders should also try to push boundaries. But ultimately, there are only two ways to fund, I would contend. The first one is what I pejoratively call the pipeline model. It is what we traditionally at Wellcome have always done, as most other funders default to, which is that you generate a machine and you generate a form and you put it on a web page and then people fill it in as best they can and you put it into an almighty great machine, process, and then out of the end comes most of the decisions, much of the ones you don't want, which is say, thank you for your idea, and no, you don't get the money, And sometimes you get the answer you do want, which is you do get the money. And what drives this machine well is you need to overload it at the beginning. So you generate, typically around the world, 80 to 90% failure rates, because that way it gives you enormous selectivity. So the first role of the funder is to set the bar as high as they can possibly get away with, without overdoing it in the way that NIH currently have a problem where funding rates in some of their areas are now below 10%, where it is, the bar is now set so high that people no longer even bother trying. And that's a problem. And getting that right is a problem. If you like, that's the pipeline model, and lots of the due diligence goes into all the process leading up to making a decision. And once you get the money, you go away and work on it. And that effectively is what we've done on a smaller scale with the India Alliance. It's tried, it's trusted, it's also very cheap to run in the office. And if you're a government agency, as you say, Shelter, that's an important consideration. If you're a charity, it's also an important consideration. We could have spent as much as we liked in the office, and welcome, we self-cap ourselves at 7%. I don't know what the figure is for DBT, but research councils in the UK is typically 3%. So they are very constrained on resource, which means they're constrained in how much feedback and help they can give to you guys sending your applications in. The other way of funding is what I call the enterprise, or is more of an industrial model. And that is, you drop the bar a little bit, and you say, and we want something very targeted in this specific thing, this area, and we will go and help select, and it might be a thematic funding call, or it might be a very directed tendering process, or anywhere on that spectrum. But you can only do that if you define very carefully what the area is that you want to fund. And you can only do that if you first run a pipeline, I would contend, because only then do you actually get access to all the best ideas that are out there in the world. And however many ideas I can come up with in the office, funnily enough, it will be a much smaller number than the several thousand of you collectively can ever come up with. And that's exactly as it should be. So the funders have a role to play, and it boils down to one of these two models, variations in between. The primary role always sits, and the sits. I would come back to Ashok. I agree entirely with Ashok. Sir Peter Medawar once said, science is the art of the soluble. Work out what is the question you want to solve. If you solve by PhD students with yourself, and that's what you do. If you can build a Hadron Collider, 21-mile ring under Jupiter, then that's what you do. You have to work out what the problem is. Then that will